earliest memories of professional wrestling are from the early 1990s. 5 years old, sat cross-legged on my living room floor in front of a television set, watching and playing wrestling. I would watch the same VHS tapes, often recorded from television, over and over, engrossed in the strange world of real-life superheroes battling in arenas filled with thousands of people far across the Atlantic. This ritual of watching wrestling was always interwoven with childhood play, be it fighting, dressing up, or recreating wrestling using action figures. Television and VHS brought this strange sport-theatre hybrid to my living room in rural England. The purpose of this short video essay, which is part of the ongoing Wrestling Resurgence project, is to explore the role that some of these ideas, which originate in childhood, have in the making and performing and experiencing of professional wrestling. It is broken down into a series of reflections on 5 themes, a few interesting ideas that I think are important to understanding the relationship between art and wrestling. As well as my own views, the essay is enriched by 2 like-minded professionals, Dr. Claire Warden, who when she is not studying and teaching drama and theatre at Loughborough University, is researching and writing about professional wrestling, as well as commentating and hosting Wrestling Resurgence live events. Claire and I are joined by Tom Dawkins, who, as a professional wrestler, plays a character called Cara Noir. Tom, through innovative creative movement and unique character work, is one of the UK's most exciting professional wrestlers, an artist who embodies the 4 themes this short essay explores. As contemporary wrestling fans, performers, professionals, observers, producers, theorists, moonlighters, fantasists and obsessives, we no longer need to look to America and Mexico or Japan. There is a homegrown resurgence. British wrestling is having a moment of contemporaneity.
And I think wrestling really allows participants and audience members to regain something that was lost. I think there is, because of that, a level of nostalgia about it, that actually when I go to a wrestling show, when I engage with a wrestling show, I can have that sense of nostalgia that reminds me of being a child. That's not to say that wrestling is childish, because I don't think it is. It's not childish. It encourages a childlike appreciation of the world, a childlike excitement about the world, which means that it kind of breaks through that sense of the mundane or that sense of the everyday that we experience in adult life all the time. You know, we do these things every single day. We're part of particular commercial or capitalist systems that kind of force us into particular roles in society. Wrestling allows us for a moment, although of course it is based in these capitalist systems, but it allows us to break out of those systems and allows us to have a moment of joyfulness, allows us to have a moment of euphoria in some ways, where we go and we sit in this space with other like-minded people and we play with them. We sit next to them and we have chants with each other and we play with the people that are performing for us, and we appreciate them as friends, actually. And that might sound like a little grand, because saying, well, you know, here's my friend wrestling, but actually I think within the British wrestling community, for me, that's one of its strengths.
For me, I go in with sections of matches where they're completely blank. I have no idea what I'm going to do, and I'm going to play and see what happens. I want to see how the audience are going to respond to it. I want to see how my opponent's going to respond to it, and it could completely go pear-shaped, but also I could find something that I've never even thought of before in the moment of play. I think play is really important because it's where you find the most about yourself as an individual.
The process of creating imaginary wrestling events and acting them out, of playing wrestling, left me with a lifelong fascination with the inner workings of this weird and wonderful performance form, to the extent that I now work in wrestling and am involved in planning real-life events. Professional wrestling is inherently collaborative. The performance form, at the very least, requires 2 people. There is no such thing as solo wrestling. Further, a live audience is required, which acts as an additional performer, a co-curator. The interaction between these critical components is the performance form in its most basic. Wrestling is, of course, inherently violent, As seen by the audience, it is simulated combat, two people fighting each other. However, the underlying movements and sequences that make the routines possible are fundamentally cooperative. Much like many forms of dance, wrestling is partnered, and in this partnership exists trust, care and responsibility for others. Feelings that are shared with the audience. We want to see the performers get beaten up, but we don't wish them actual harm.
Understand physical touch is, I think, a gift of wrestling, because it's hard to find that outside. The only time I've kind of come across it is, there's two kind of things.
Sort of contact improv.
Yeah, contact improvisation, where you go into a class and you essentially touch, move, explore spaces with an individual for 5 minutes that you've never met before, and then you'll move on to someone else. And the sense of bond that you have afterwards, it's almost euphoric. This stranger then becomes a friend without sharing a word, and I think that's the same with wrestling. Once you've wrestled someone, there's a bond that's built. There's like, oh, I trust you, you kept me safe, and we had a fun time.
But conditioning is important. I don't know whether you see, like, before matches, I always like to give myself a hit, like hit my legs, hit my chest, hit my stomach, hit my shoulders, hit in between the joints, so that I'm like conditioning myself ready for battle. Because bear in mind, it is a performance art, but we are taking it to extremes. We do hit each other, and there are elements where things are going to hurt.
Going hand in hand with play, imagination, as with all storytelling, is critical to making and experiencing performances of professional wrestling. In the bingo hall, working men's club, theatre or sports arena, we all, performers and spectators, imagine together, fluctuating between a knowing appreciation of the performance as staged and a state of suspended disbelief, that point where we lose ourselves in the stories being told.
And I think that notion of the what if is really key to actually understanding wrestling practice. What if I am this character that I am playing? Like, what does that feel like, and how do I portray that on stage? And actually, for wrestlers, that becomes even more interesting, because a lot of the wrestlers will say that their character is them turned up a little bit, or that they actually find it quite difficult to tell the difference between themselves and their character. And imagination in some ways leads to a presentation of something newly real, if that makes sense. Like it's a new thing. Your imagination becomes concrete, I suppose, in the character that you're playing. And I think the other thing about imagination that interests me is around the way that wrestling inspires an audience imagination as well. So, we are asked to, in essence, suspend our disbelief, as you would do in the theatre, but to do so in a slightly different way, to do so in a very engaged way, in a way that welcomes me as an audience member into the performance, doesn't distance me from it, actually welcomes me in, to create that imaginative experience with the wrestler.
In wrestling, a hope spot is essentially when the heat is happening, when the babyface or the good guy is getting beaten up. If he lays flat on his back and completely dies, the hope of the audience dies. They don't believe in him anymore. So but it's good to put in a hope sequence, a bit in the heat to keep up that taste, that, oh my God, he's actually gonna, he's gonna get all the way to, it's close to doing the comeback. He's not quite got enough. It's the bit in the Rocky movie when he gets a good hit in and then he carries on getting beaten down. It's that moment of but they still believe. You've got to keep them along the ride. It's interesting when you talk about hopes, because for me, that's the improv in my head, and it takes a lot of my concentration to be able to drive and also to be able to visualise the match.
Visualising strikes, visualising movements and visualising sequences. I guess that's a different topic for a different day, but yeah, it's important to find out your learning skill and the way you learn. So I'm a tactile visual learner, so a kinesthetic learner. So I learn by touch, doing movements and visualising. So if you ever see me plan a match, I'll physically do the pre-show wrestling dance and try to remember the match. Oh yeah, because I've got to get it in my body.
So I think there's imagination in the ring created by the wrestlers themselves, and then I think it relies on the imagination of everything else around it as well. So it becomes a kind of imaginative, and to use a kind of contemporary theatrical parlance, a kind of immersive experience. I become immersed in it, and I find it difficult to tell where the imagination stops and the real, I'm not sure if I can use that word, but the real begins on the other way around. I think that's one thing, reasons why wrestling has such a kind of powerful resonance among those that follow it, because that's the exciting bit, that you're never quite sure. That's what makes it particularly exciting, I think.
The imaginary world of professional wrestling is fragile, in the sense that it can be broken or interrupted at any moment, but it is also flexible. Reality can be bended and manipulated to further enhance our experience of this imaginary world. The real and unreal collide. Wrestling audiences are invited into the making of the show. In this sense, wrestling is highly democratic. The tastes, values and beliefs of those that consume it bleed into the actions and reactions of those that perform for them. Like the act of performance itself, there is a closeness, a bond formed between actors and viewers, performers and co-performers, between wrestlers and fans with fellow fans. An important part of what has made wrestling in the UK over the last decade so unique is the creation of the community around the art form.
British wrestling has somehow amazingly managed to hone this experience, this community experience, which means that the people who come and watch and are invested in it really do feel like friends of the performers. There's that sense of creating this experience together. I think that's, for me, is what's so deeply exciting about it, and has potential, as I think wrestling has a lot of potential in lots of different ways, but has the potential to create new communities, has a potential to allow people who perhaps feel disenfranchised from society to regain that sense of childlike appreciation of the world, and to come and enjoy being part of this community.
Much like sports such as football, British wrestling, or BritWres as it is affectionately known, has been able to offer its audiences a sense of belonging. In an increasingly politically and culturally fragmented world, people who may have been disenfranchised or marginalised have found something that they can be a part of. We are supporters rather than simply viewers or punters.